Hi, and welcome to Module 4, where we're going to talk about the process performance link in the context of new product development performance. This is going to relate to some of the modules that we discussed before. We want to provide an overview, kind of an idea of how these previous chapters or modules fit in the grander scheme of things in terms of understanding new product development performance. And as you can imagine, there's lots of different variables that have been looked at by practitioners and researchers. So understanding this a little better is imperative. So you can imagine, and given what we have discussed in the class before, and given what you've seen in the marketplace, NPD, new product development, performance is intrinsically connected to firm performance, right? Whether it's attracting new customer segments, retaining existing ones, attracting particular investors, increase stakeholder engagement and scrutiny sometimes, right? If I develop a particular product that has very strong reactions or creates some sort of turbulence. We can take Tesla, for example, right? You remember the autonomous driving feature. That's a pretty cool feature, but it does, potentially create some hazards that have then been exploited in the social media world. Similarly, right, you might attract some regulatory scrutiny that you didn't want to. Let's take Facebook or any of the social media companies, for example, currently TikTok, right, that's been investigated or looked at. But the idea is that the new product development, right, in it of itself is very important for companies. And so the question is, what kind of variables play a role? What kind of empirical research have we seen? And how do we all tie this together? Now, you recognize these slides. I showed these slides in some of the previous modules. These were just some overviews. The idea is really different companies will measure in performance of NPD differently, whether that's which projects meet their goals and what those goals are, right? Use the organization's performance as a benchmark for competitors or prior performance, resource allocation, employee compensation, future innovation strategies, et cetera, et cetera. We typically use, companies use a combination of factors that they've come up with that should kind of make an impact on their company and how NPD relates to that. Some questions we've seen, remember when we, in the first module, we talked how digitalization has changed cycle times a little bit, and how companies that produce digital products just have to produce these products a lot faster, right? That the producing physical products those cycle times have shortened, both for incremental and radical innovations, but especially for digital products, that is a super important metric. We have whether projects kind of meet deadlines, whether they stay within budget, or they actually have a completed product or service that came out of there. Those are some of the metrics that kind of have been used, and I'm sure you have seen a fair amount of these in the companies you've worked for, or maybe other class projects where they discuss these types of measures and how they're relating to firm performance. Innovation is a big thing, right? So we talked about innovation in the first module, and the idea is, well, in addition to kind of these budget and project management milestones, how do I innovate in general, right? So how much innovation goes into my new products and services? How do I measure that? And is that an indicator of innovation performance in general? Now, we can put this together. And again, this is it's a simplification of how this complex process or these complex relationships works. We obviously typically look at an input, process, output model. We have multiple things that go into or influence the new product development process, some that are not under the control of the firm, right? So such as market conditions, external shocks, competitors to a degree, regulations, and new technology. Those can have significant effects on how I develop new products. But there can also be internal inputs, right? So competitive strategy, product strategy, business model, work allocation policies, organizational features, right? These things can play into that. I can select from a broad set of kind of supporting tools like Six Sigma. We'll talk about that in a little later. The Kano model, TRIZ, I used to do that a lot in engineering. Voice of the customer, Gantt and RAM charts. You've seen this in Management 519. You've talked about Gantt and RAM charts in this class for a little bit when we talked about processes. And then we also you've also discussed this, and most likely and hopefully in other in other project management classes. And of course, we have a series of outputs, right? Whether that's commercial performance, market share, customer retention, competitive advantage. And if we put these together, right, there is some sort of feedback, of course, that we have. Your competitors will influence your business model or your product strategy, your output, whether it's commercial performance or market share, will also influence work allocation policies or organizational features, etc. So we have this cycle of feedback loops that all kind of play together. Now, you can imagine that researchers and practitioners really interested in how the different factors impact product development success. You've seen a model here that includes unit cost, technical performance, market share, profitability, time to market, R&D budget, and all these play a role in this, in the commercial success of new product development processes. Here you have a little bit of a simpler model. You have product quality, product size, product lines, product design that affect organizational performance, in this case, financial profitability, sales volume, customer loyalty, etc. You can, not that you will, but if you ever have the opportunity on Google Scholar, for example, or any other research database, you will find tons of these kind of conceptual and empirical models that try to connect different factors. Some of you might have used Salesforce or other customer relationship management tools. There have also been models looking at that and the influence these things have together with other factors on new product performance, for example. Then we have IT, which is a pretty popular, or information technology is a pretty popular topic, and how information technology helps improve new product development processes, but also ultimately NPD performance. Now, one big factor here is what we call market orientation. I mean, the terminology is pretty intuitive. It's the degree to which a firm focuses on understanding and satisfying the needs of its customers. You can imagine market orientation influencing NPD performance in several ways. You can think about providing customer insights. Then you have cross-functional collaboration. Intuitively, right, if you are very market-oriented, right? Meaning that you're very close to your customer and you collect data on your customer, that you're typically gonna develop better follow-up products, or also improve the functionalities and the features of your current products, right? So market orientation is important, and the tools, or whatever tools the companies use to do that, will kind of determine that success factor. Could be they use their own product to collect data, could be they hire external data collection companies, they might do focus groups, et cetera. But the idea is really, I want to get as much customer information as possible, right? Maybe I have products out there that are already in the marketplace, and I want to collect information on them, or I want to really check or explore how my product idea or my prototype could be received in the marketplace. And what, of course, ideally we want to what we want to have is cross-functional collaboration. We're going to see this factor kind of pop up in the next couple of slides, so you see how important it's, how its importance is weighed in terms of the literature. But the idea is really, okay, I have different divisions within a company, and those divisions need to be as close as possible. Remember, we talked about these different team configurations. We don't want silos. Silos means that information that is collected by these different divisions might not be put together in a really useful way if they don't communicate, or they have some sort of solid cross-functional collaboration structures. Now, this is an important, so we'll talk about organizational learning a little more in the upcoming slides. But this is a very central concept in processing kind of the information and external and internal factors into NPD performance, right? So if your organization doesn't have learning structures, or don't have systems in place of how they can collect and analyze outside information, or also internal information, they're going to struggle to do a proper continuous improvement process for new product development. And that also, of course, is directly connected to the faster response to market changes, right? So if I'm more market-oriented, and also I have a good organization learning capability, I'll be able to actually take the information I get from my customers and produce those product adjustments a lot faster than companies that don't do that. Obviously, big tech has a big leg up there. We know Amazon, Google, Facebook, Meta, they are pretty data hungry, right? So they're collecting tons of external data, a lot of customer interaction data, and they are trying to derive insights from those to better target their products and services. We know that Meta targeted ads are very powerful. It's no coincidence that they have essentially replaced a lot of newspapers and other ad avenues because of the data they collect, and they can really pinpoint ad offers accordingly, and so does Google and other other companies that have more data-oriented business models. Now, one thing I nearly forgot, and that's important, is that some of these companies keep building products that keep collecting data from you, right? And that's been one of the issues that we've seen with regulation that kind of pointed that out. But sometimes companies do this really well, right? So Amazon, yes, it uses its infrastructure and its platform to not only do transactions, but also offer cloud computing services to companies. They're using the Amazon Echo essentially as a platform as an extension of, as a kind of smart home device, and as an extension of kind of your legs and arms and voice, to help you essentially ask for things, coordinate with somebody, take phone calls, etc., right, to manage part of your everyday activities. And at the same time, that device itself also collects some data, although in some cases they shouldn't. But building products that kind of continue the data collection, or maybe collect data that is different from what you've done before, right, to kind of understand the customer even better. That's one of the key kind of the key competitive advantage factors here for big technology companies. Obviously, a market-oriented approach can help you build a competitive advantage, and that can positively influence NPD performance. Again, being closer to your customer than competitors or competing products will help you not only incrementally, but over time, build a better reputation, decrease the switching, increase the switching costs of your customers, right? So customers that know that you're very oriented towards building new and customized products, will be less likely to switch to another provider. That's pretty critical. Market orientation can also enhance innovation, although in this case, it's more that it's enhancing a certain innovation direction, right? So the closer you are to your customer, obviously the innovations will be closer to existing products and services. That might somewhat lock you into a particular direction or particular path of innovation that might be disruptible, right, by other participants. You might not want to be too committed too much, right? So you have to, when you develop something new that changes of how things work or are a little bit unusual for the customer to operate, you have to be kind of make this transition properly if that product and service is really providing a lot better value than the previous iterations. We talked about this in Management 519. We probably alluded to it in the previous slides a little bit, but the idea is, right, firms have resources, they generate resources through their products and services, and in order to continue to develop those, they need to have some sort of research and development budget. Again, it depends on the type of company and the type of industry, how these development budgets or these R&D budgets, essentially, how large they are and what they can influence. But they're very important in terms of how new product development processes and what new products are being developed in terms of the resources that you have, right? Now, we're using a term that's R&D intensity, and that is essentially just the ratio of R&D expenditure to total sales or total revenue. And so that reflects essentially a firm's commitment to innovation and strategic focus on developing products. But here the idea is, right, we need to kind of calculate a metric that is not just the absolute budget of R&D, of how much I spend, which is, of course, in total terms important, but also in relation of how much of my total budget goes to R&D, right? And that kind of gives me, and potentially investors and regulators, a signal of how committed or how involved I am in these development processes. Typically, it's R&D intensity, meaning if you put more resources in the R&D budget, you'll be able to adapt better to customer preferences, right? Technology and market trends, essentially integrating these because you have more people to look into that. You have more structures built up. You might have more equipment infrastructure that can help you do that. But at the same time, you can also that resource advantage can also help you work with more external partners and potentially share resources or trade resources. And those can be university suppliers or other companies. It really depends how you kind of configure these things. Now, China, okay, we talk about China a lot, whether it's through TikTok or the kind of the increased competition we have to see. There's some geopolitics involved with that. However, when we look at R&D expenditure, right, and we can also look at R&D expenditure on the country level, not only on a firm level. What we've seen is that developed economies, or United States, EU, and Japan have been kind of leaders, like slowly improving, well, more continuously improving their R&D expenditures, especially the EU and the US. And what we've seen is that in recent years, that trajectory, right, the rate of increase in R&D expenditure has been pretty significant for China and Chinese companies. And we see this a bit more here. This is essentially, you can take a closer look here, but the idea when you have the slides, but the idea here is you have different types of development trajectories, experimental development, applied research, and basic research. All of these have been, we've seen some major increases for the US as well as China, Japan and South Korea. So we've seen certainly some good improvements there. When it comes to companies, Amazon, Alphabet, Microsoft, Huawei, Apple, Samsung, and Meta have been pretty dominant players in terms of their R&D investment expenditure. That's data from 2020. But essentially, Amazon here, the leader in terms of total spending. With respect to the share of all sales, Meta has actually been the strongest, followed by Huawei. So what we've seen, however, is that all these companies spend a significant amount of dollars for R&D because they have to build new products and services, and for that they need the appropriate resources. This is just another statistic for national R&D intensity for a set of other countries, UK, Germany, Taiwan, etc., etc. You have R&D expenditures here also by industry, okay? And not surprisingly, pharmaceuticals and biotechnology kind of lead the pack. Typically, those have the largest, they spend the largest amounts of dollars for doing R&D work. Now, you can imagine, right, that new product development performance also depends on structure and size of the organization. Small entrepreneurial firms typically are more radical in their innovation because they have to compete with incumbents or established incumbent products and services. Therefore, they have to be more radical in order to close that gap, surpass some of these. Larger, more established firms, on the other hand, they have more resources, but they're also a little less innovative. They tend to try to put these continuous improvements or this incremental innovation through their existing product portfolio. Think about the different Apple iterations for iPhones. There's been recently some pushback on that people are just not interested in keep changing their iPhone. every year, which is also why Apple kind of tries to adjust their payment model a little bit, hoping to get more people into that realm, or reducing their need for large upfront investments. Now, team-based organizations is kind of a popular term, and we've seen this, we'll see this around. Typically, every organization considers themselves a team-based organization, but the idea here is really that we have team-based structures put in the company, in the development processes, very strategically and very commonly, so that we don't have kind of these different division and different silos. We don't have a lot of individual kind of excluded performance. Here we want team-based structures that kind of encourage collaboration, knowledge sharing, problem solving, especially across functional areas. And an example, but there's plenty of others, is Gore-Tex, is the Gore and Associates who produce Gore-Tex fabric. They implement a lot of team-based structures. But again, you see this a lot in software companies as well. Again, how these team-based structures exactly look like, right? How do you put teams together? How do you dissolve them? What process tools they're using, that varies significantly. Now, we have another structure that's called skunkworks, and you might have heard that before. It's typically the divisions in a company that do kind of wacky stuff, but typically they're tasked with looking at more radical innovations, like high risk, high reward projects, that they can essentially, that if they work well, the company can profit from it. But if they don't work well, the resources that they allocated are not catastrophic if they're losing those resources to the organization. The term was kind of used by Lockheed Martin. I'm sure other firms have used a similar structure or similar configuration, might not call it skunkworks. But in any case, you'll see this in bigger and smaller companies, really depends. Some of these divisions, some of these skunkworks divisions are taken seriously. Sometimes these skunkworks divisions exist to kind of push people that are not, that either can't be fired, or the company doesn't want to fire, and kind of put them in there. Hopefully they're going to quit voluntarily. But so things have been, these kind of structures are being used differently by different companies. But typically you want to have kind of these more radical and highly innovative projects in there. Then something related, but that's conceptually a little different, is called Innovation Garage. That's typically a space for different individuals and teams, different divisions, to kind of pitch ideas and think about and test ideas and prototype ideas. We talked about prototyping, design thinking in the previous module. Here the idea is really, we want to have a space where people like to kind of work with each other. They express their creativity, they take some risks, they can iterate quickly, they can build some prototypes to test and show. Nordstrom does that. Other places do that as well. Google does it a lot. Amazon, partly. Some software engineers there have told me maybe it's not that common there, but there are places where this is kind of building this space to perform and to kind of share things is common for some companies. We have something that's called intrapreneurship, and it's kind of a combination between entrepreneurship and intra, which means in this case in the company, right? So entrepreneurship in the company. And the idea here is that, again, similar to Innovation Garage, I want to incentivize individuals, typically on an individual level, focus or incentivize employees on an individual level to develop new ideas or come up with innovation projects. Sometimes then they group together. Sometimes they kind of write these white papers in companies. You see that sometimes. Sometimes entrepreneurship is used to spin off companies, spin off companies within a company, right? So in combination with skunkworks, when you come up with some really nice or clever project or product that doesn't quite fit in the company's product portfolio, but you think it has a potential to be spun out and kind of build a separate company out of that. That happens. But again, typically, those are kind of work allocation policies, 3M, and we'll see Google later too. They have what's called the 15% rule. They might have adjusted that over the time, which is also one of the risks you have to take as a company, figuring out, offering that, and then figuring out whether people spend really 15% or they spend a significantly a bigger amount of time on their kind of hobbies or hobby ideas or innovative ideas that they think of for other things. So you have to figure that out. As a company, you have to be very careful, kind of balancing that properly. Otherwise, you have most people just working on their own stuff and forgetting the company interests. Then we have something called a modular organization. Really not uncommon. I mean, Apple does that a lot. Boeing has done that. Is giving work packages or outsourcing certain parts of the company. And those can also be development processes for certain components. Boeing did that for some components of their plane. I think Japan, Italy, and Britain, British companies, they kind of help build some of the structures in the plane. And of course, then they can develop their own innovation and product development processes. And you see this also a lot in software development, where parts of that are being kind of given out to other parties. Of course, you have to be careful understanding kind of the intellectual property implications. And so that's kind of a way to think about how organizational structure can affect new product development process performance, but also new product development in general. Now, organizational learning, okay, we talked about organizational creativity, but learning is a really central component of every company, right? And so figuring out what kind of tools and structures and incentive systems I need to put in to not only foster organizational learning, but also capture it and measure it, right? So what are we kind of really looking for? How do I test whether my company is good in organizational learning, right? And typically it means, how do I digest external information? How do I foster internal learning mechanisms? Making sure that learning is collaborative, right? Learning is shared. It's not just putting learning outcomes or learning modules into like different parts of the companies that nobody's ever going to see. So figuring that out is tricky, but companies have to do that to be successful. Now, obviously, we talked before, right? To going fast to market, right? Or having faster responses to market or market orientation. Here, the idea is if I collect a lot of knowledge, right, from my customers or the users, then how do I use that knowledge essentially to improve my products or develop new ones? Adidas does that, Amazon does that. You see a lot more companies will use kind of data on their project or collect data on their products and services to develop customers and do some customer acquisition as well. Again, here we're talking about cross-functional collaboration. I mean, this is a big part, right? So knowledge acquisition, knowledge sharing, and cross-functional collaboration is important in organizational learning. These are some really key components. How to do that is tricky, right? Again, we talked about added Adidas and Amazon. Spotify uses something what they call squads, right? They have these small autonomous teams. We talked about that type of structure in, I think it was module 2. These kind of autonomous teams, they can essentially, through cross-functional collaboration, start kind of doing various developments on products and services. As Spotify, I don't know if who of you uses it, but they have come out in the last couple of years. They have come out with some really nice updates and additions and features. Right, they're similar to Netflix. They're also in the content creation game. Right, they've done this as well. So think about how content creation teams might be different than platform development teams, right? And so, but they still have to kind of work together to figure out, how do I promote certain content? Like, how do I put it in the algorithm? How do people kind of interact with certain content, et cetera, et cetera. So these are all kind of important components to think about. We have experimentation, learning from failure. That's a big factor. How do I set up the right systems? How do I put systems in place to help people do that? We talked about the innovation lab, right? But here there's a clear connection between that and organizational learning. Building experiments and being very being experiments, but being systematic about the outcomes and how to create, how to generate information is really critical. Dyson does that. I don't know if you have Dyson vacuum cleaners, that they're very good, but they're also very expensive, but they're very well engineered. And so to do that, they have a lot of prototypes, right? So they work on a lot of prototypes, which is also why these vacuum cleaners are more expensive, right? They spend a significant amount of development on doing that. But they therefore also kind of target a very specific customer segment. And we'll talk about that kind of business model adjustment in a bit. Yeah, continuous improvement. Again, not all products and services will be radically new or disruptive. But if you want to expand your market share, if you want to establish your name or brand name in the marketplace, you need to continuously improve, or at least show your customers or users how you're continuously improving your products, but also your processes in order to deliver faster, to avoid errors, to avoid miscommunication, etc. General Electric has used what's called Six Sigma. Some of you have probably heard about it. You might have discussed it in other classes. I'm just giving you kind of a very brief bird's eye view on this. But Six Sigma has been attributed to a lot of cost cutting, better customer satisfaction, better product development, improved quality. That's a really big factor there. And so it's essentially alluding to a statistical sigma, right? Which kind of you're looking at standard deviations and errors, right? So how many errors do you have in this case, per million opportunities? And I want to minimize those defects, right? Especially if I'm a car manufacturer, if I'm Tesla, if I have airplanes, etc. Right? I want to make sure that the number of defects is as minimal as possible, because if you're a car manufacturer, you have to recall the car to fix things that's exceedingly expensive. Motorola kind of taking the credit for developing it in the 1980s, and it's usually using a methodology or a framework called define, measure, analyze, improve, and control. Again, you need to have tools in place to do all these things, right? Tools and processes. It has very little value if all the managers talk about Six Sigma, but the processes are not aligned with it, right? That you don't have policies and technology and tools in place to to manage and collect the data, process the data, discuss the data, and kind of develop and test reliable solutions from these. Now, obviously, organizational learning, it does enhance innovation capabilities. Again, the problem with some of the problems with innovation are have to do with what kind of innovation you're focused on, right? If you're more interested in radical innovation, your kind of organizational learning processes might look different than if you're trying to push more incremental innovation, and it's also strongly connected to your technology adoption, right? So what kind of technologies are you using? You can imagine, back in the days when engineers had to do blueprints or had to hand sketch blueprints that took a long time. If you had lots of components, you had like rooms full of engineers that had to do that. Now with computer-aided design and manufacturing, you can share a lot faster, you can produce a lot faster. People can look at this in 3D, or they can make changes, or they can run simulations. That has some significant improvements in capabilities with respect to kind of innovation outcomes. That also is related to policies, right? We talked about 3M's 15% time policy. Google does something similar. Again, the trick is to make sure people really kind of work on things that eventually relate to Google products. Google is claiming that Gmail, Google News, and AdSense, for example, came out of that policy. Hard for us to really check, but the fact that something like that is in place does mean that Google and other companies might use similar things. They value that kind of innovation and creativity process. We talked, the people who took, for all of you who took Management 519, we talked a little bit about absorptive capacity, not in a very extended fashion. And keep in mind that, right, absorptive capacity, like the firm's ability to recognize the value of new information, assimilate and apply it to commercial ends, is effectively a subcategory of organizational learning, right? And so that's why we want to talk a little bit about it, right? The idea is what parts of, how does absorptive capacity kind of play into new product performance or product development performance? You can imagine that if it's a subcategory of organizational learning, and organizational learning is significantly affecting that, then as absorptive capacity will also play a role. Again, we talked about acquisition and application of external knowledge. An example is P&G developed a program called Connect and Develop. They work with external parties, and those external parties kind of help them develop new knowledge and co-develop innovative products. That could be design consultants like IDEO. It could be individual programmers or software developers, or it could be physical prototype builders, right? There could be a variety of experts that they can work with. And again, they're saying that help them build the Swiffer Duster and Mr. Clean Magic Eraser. I don't know if you've used any of these products, but P&G is definitely known for building really powerful idea and knowledge networks to kind of help them with product development. Again, we've seen cross-functional collaboration. Again, the more cross-functional it is, right, the easier it is for us to take external knowledge, process it through the different divisions, right, R&D, management, marketing, whatever other else you have, and then sitting in a table or having a meeting or having an informal conversation and saying, hey, have you looked at this new technology? We could do this. How do you guys what do you guys could do with this technology? Or how do we kind of improve our products and developments there? So lastly, we want to look at how business models and new product development performance relate. Those of you who've taken Management 519 will most likely recognize this. Again, I don't want to talk too much about business models here. The idea is just to give everyone who might have had different definitions or maybe haven't really had a really clear picture of what that is and what components are part of a business model to kind of to do a little bit of a review. The idea is business models have all kinds of different definitions and emphases. They're often interchangeably used as a business concept, revenue model, economic model, et cetera, et cetera. The idea is there is an economic component to every business model, obviously. There is an architectural component, right? So how are internal processes aligned? How do they produce certain outcomes? There also is a strategy, right? So the business model also dictates my firm strategy to a degree, right? What do I want to focus on? What customers am I targeting? And so inconsistencies between these things can essentially lead to a business model and or strategy not to be perfectly aligned to what you actually want to produce. And here are some components, other components of how do we create value, what is the source of our competitive advantage, who do we create value for, how do we differentiate ourselves, make money, time scope, size ambitions, etc. Right? So again, these will differ based on industry. They will differ based on size of the company. Smaller firms might be, again, more related, more connected to, or more focused towards more radical innovations. Established companies are more focused on developing additional revenue streams, right? So they can kind of monetize their products and services more, and do that more. This is a business model canvas. That's just one way to visualize a business model. Again, some of you will recognize it from Management 519 that I've taught. You might recognize it from other classes you took at Anderson, or maybe seen it in your research. The idea is really, sorry, these different factors significantly impact your new product development, right? So whether it's what kind of products I want to produce or what kind of processes I engage in, this is all you have to consider, put these all into a structure to better understand, right? If I target, if I'm a watchmaker and I target high-priced, or I target richer or more affluent customers, my product has to have a certain quality or a certain set of features, right? And then how do I develop revenue streams from my product and service? So all these things have to be considered. Again, this is just kind of a review, but also kind of a connection to this new product development, business modeling intersection. Obviously, value proposition alignment, revenue streams and pricing, distribution channels. Again, we'll talk about pricing in the next module. Here, the idea is I can align my pricing accordingly, right? My product and my pricing need to be aligned such that the market doesn't confuse, that there is no signal confusion, right? So Tesla is considering itself a premium producer. Yes, they want to build these things at scale, right? So Model 3, et cetera, but they're targeting a particular set of customers and users. And so you've seen now they do these price cuts, right? Because they're kind of thinking about affordability. Typically, they were higher priced than comparable electric cars from manufacturers like GM and Ford. And so the price, you can use the price to kind of create these signals. And that has to be aligned with your product strategy. Again, customer relationships, right? And so good customer relationships will help in the adoption of your product and service, right? Poor customer relationships can do the opposite. So you want to make sure that that's the case, and also how do you intend your product to be used, right? Also to avoid misuse of components of your product or your entire product and services. business models help you figure out resource allocation, right? We talked about the R&D budget and how the R&D budget influences new product development performance. But other parts of your company, right? Other resources, marketing, manufacturing, etc., those have to be properly aligned to support your NPD process. Scalability, innovation, and differentiation. Again, depends what you want to do, right? Do you want to address address a large part of the market, right? What kind of products do you want to build for that? How are you going to scale those products and services, etc.? And then how do you want to regulate innovation and differentiation? All right, and that concludes with essentially the module 4 that we've been discussing. Again, the idea here is to provide kind of a more complete perspective on which factors are playing a role in new product development processes and new product development itself. It helps us kind of connect to the things we discussed in the previous 3 modules, but will also build a bridge to the upcoming 2 modules for this class. I hope you enjoyed it and the information was useful to you. I will see you in the next module. Enjoy.